Ben thought his dog Sadie had died in the wildfire. For 3 months, she was gone. No tracks, no sightings, nothing. Then on the morning he finally gave up hope, he got a call. A lone German shepherd had been spotted lying beside a fresh grave, unmoving, silent, like she was guarding something. When Ben arrived and saw what she was protecting, his knees gave out. Because it wasn't just any grave, and what Sadie had kept safe would change everything he thought he knew about the woman buried there. Ethan Miller had learned to live with silence. At 37, the former Marine had swapped battlefield chaos for the quiet ache of isolation in the remote forests of Colorado. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and weary blue eyes, Ethan wore his trauma like an old coat, worn but familiar. He worked as a forest ranger now, spending most days alone. But he wasn't truly alone. Scout was with him. His German shepherd, 9 years old, with graying fur around her muzzle and a deep scar on her left flank, a remnant from their last tour in Afghanistan, was more than a dog. She was family. His partner in war, his anchor in peace. Every morning they hiked the snow-covered ridges. Every evening they sat on the porch together as the sun dipped behind the peaks, until the night she disappeared. It was bitter cold, late January. Wind moaned through the trees. Ethan had just stoked the fire and poured himself a cup of coffee when Scout suddenly stood up. Her ears perked, and she stared at the door with rigid focus. No bark, no growl, just pure alertness. "You hear something, girl?" he asked. Scout gave a low whine. She scratched once at the door. Ethan opened it. "Go check it out. I'll be right here." Scout slipped outside like a shadow and vanished into the darkness. That was the last he saw of her. The hours that followed. At first, Ethan wasn't worried. Scout had wandered a bit before, never far. But an hour passed, then 2. Ethan whistled into the night, called her name. Nothing. By morning, worry had calcified into dread. He threw on his ranger gear and grabbed his snow boots, trekking into the tree line behind his cabin. Scout's paw prints were faint in the snow, scattered among those of deer, rabbits, and something else. Coyote tracks. "Damn it, girl," he muttered. He followed them for miles, over icy ravines and frozen creeks, his voice echoing through the woods. At noon, he reached a bluff and screamed her name. "Scout!" No response. His throat tightened. This wasn't just about a lost dog. This was about losing the only soul who'd stood by him after the war, after the VA visits, after he stopped calling people back. Losing her felt like losing himself all over again. Desperation and doubt. Back at the cabin, Ethan printed flyers, posted on local forums, and drove to nearby towns. He handed out Scout's picture to gas stations and diners. "She's chipped," he'd say. "Loyal, won't approach strangers." People were kind, but no one had seen her. The second night, Ethan sat on the porch alone, watching the woods. He left the porch light on. He left her blanket by the door. He barely slept. By the 5th day, snow had covered her tracks entirely. Then came the guilt. What if he hadn't opened the door? What if he had followed her immediately? His chest ached with it. Scout had always protected him. What if this time she'd gone to protect someone else? 7 days passed. Ethan hadn't stopped searching. He took his ranger vehicle farther off-road than he was supposed to, hiked trails no one touched in winter, and even borrowed a thermal drone from the sheriff's department. But there was no heat signature, no movement, no Scout, until he found the grave. It was the 8th morning, a Wednesday. Cold light fell through the pine branches as Ethan patrolled an unmarked access trail, a narrow, frozen path he'd only taken twice in the last year. He was about to turn back when he saw the tracks. Dog tracks, and fresh ones. They moved through the snow with purpose, stopping at a clearing Ethan didn't recognize. It was small, barely 20 feet across, with an old wooden bench and a single stone marker poking out of the ground like a tooth. What hit him first wasn't the headstone. It was the dog. The reunion scout sat beside the grave, silent, still, covered in frost and earth dust, as if she'd been there for hours. Her ears twitched as Ethan approached, but she didn't turn. Her gaze was locked on the gravestone. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his voice cracked with emotion. "Scout, girl, it's me." She slowly turned her head. Her eyes met his, tired, alert, but alive. And then she whimpered. It broke him. He buried his face into her fur, arms wrapped around her shaking body. She leaned into him, pressing her weight against his chest. She smelled of pine needles and grave dirt. He didn't ask questions at first. He was too relieved, too overcome. She hadn't left him. She'd stayed with someone else. But who? The name on the headstone. Ethan's breath clouded in the air as he pulled back and looked at the grave. The stone was new, fresh granite, soil still loose around it. It read, Amanda C. Reynolds, 1998 to 2024. Loved beyond words. No last goodbye. No dates. Just that. Ethan frowned. He didn't know the name. He hadn't heard of any burials out here, and he would have. He patrolled this forest, no permit, no formal cemetery. Then he saw something tucked beneath the headstone, a tiny, sun-bleached notebook wrapped in weathered cloth. He opened it. Inside were short entries, names, dates, little phrases, and a sketch. A girl, smiling, long hair, with a German shepherd beside her. Scout. A mystery begins. Ethan felt the chill crawl through his spine. How did Scout know this person? Why was she here? And why did it feel like she'd brought him to this place? Not the other way around? That night, he drove Scout home, wrapped her in blankets, fed her broth. But his thoughts weren't on her recovery. They were on Amanda Reynolds, and the question that had taken root in his mind. What secret was Scout guarding out there? And why did she refuse to leave that grave? The morning after the ranger's tip, Ben loaded his dusty Ford truck and drove through the hills toward Maple Hollow Cemetery. The small cemetery was tucked into a grove of pines, quiet, old, forgotten by most. But as he parked and stepped out onto the soft ground, he felt something strange. A hush that wasn't just silence. It was reverence. And then he saw her, Sadie. She was sitting perfectly still beside a fresh grave with no marker. Her tail curled around her paws, her ears twitching faintly at the sound of his boots crunching gravel. She didn't run to him. She didn't bark. Her eyes, warm and deep, met his, but she didn't move from the grave. Ben froze. Sadie had been gone for 10 days. 10 days since the fire. 10 days since she disappeared when their cabin caught flame. He knelt down beside her slowly, gently, afraid she might be an illusion. But she was real. Her fur was singed in patches. There were tiny wounds on her legs, and one paw was wrapped in what looked like a child's scarf. She didn't whimper. She didn't even flinch. She just turned her head toward the grave and looked down. Ben's heart began to pound. "Sadie girl, what is this?" He read the freshly placed funeral bouquet. There was no name on the headstone. No engravings. Just flowers, fresh soil, and a locket lying beside it. A silver locket. And Ben recognized it. It belonged to Ellie Hastings. She was a nurse who used to bring coffee to the firehouse. She'd gone missing during the wildfire evacuations. Rumors were she'd tried to go back to her cottage for something precious, but no one knew for sure. They never found her. Ben picked up the locket, opened it. Inside was a photo of a child and a tiny lock of dark hair. His chest tightened. Sadie pawed the dirt gently, her gaze mournful. And suddenly, Ben understood. Sadie had followed Ellie, protected her, stayed with her, even after she'd passed, and then led Ben here, to pay respect, to finish the story. Ben sat beside his dog, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. In the quiet of the cemetery there was only the wind through trees, and the soft companionship of a shepherd who never left someone behind. Ben stayed at the grave for over an hour. He didn't say much, just sat with Sadie in the silence, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, the other holding the locket Ellie had clutched during her final moments. He didn't know why the grave was unmarked. Maybe she'd been found too late, or no one had claimed her. Maybe no one even knew she was gone. But Sadie had known. She'd followed Ellie into the wildfire. She must have stayed with her even as the smoke closed in, protected her until the end, and then waited there, guarding her resting place like a soldier at a post. It was almost unbearable. Ben finally rose, brushing dirt from his jeans, and looked down at Sadie, who still wouldn't leave the grave. "Come on, girl, let's take her home." Sadie didn't budge. Instead, she gently pawed at the locket, as if to say, "This stays here." Ben understood. With a quiet nod, he bent down and placed the silver locket back on the fresh soil. But he also made a promise. He would find out who buried Ellie. He would make sure she had a name, a stone, and a story. She wouldn't be forgotten. Not after what Sadie had done. 2 weeks later, Ben returned, with a headstone carved in his own garage. It read, "Ellie Hastings, a brave soul, never alone." Sadie sat beside him again that day, calm, quiet, and proud. The cemetery caretaker said he'd never seen a dog behave like that before. "It's like she knows," he whispered. "Like she remembers." Ben just nodded, because she did. In the weeks that followed, Sadie slowly began to return to normal. She played again, ate more, even nudged Ben's hand to throw sticks at the river. But every Sunday morning, she would sit by the door, and every Sunday, Ben would drive her back to Maple Hollow, where she'd sit by the grave for a little while, not out of grief, but out of love. And Ben came to realize, some dogs don't just guard homes, they guard hearts, even the ones that stopped beating.